dynamic. Let's get down to business. Mental self-defense of fitness.
Older than hip hop. So 50 years to me is like, hey, you know. And I come to you rappers and read the contract. I said, you did the same when you
bought a car.
I accept on.
Do you remember Chuck D? The man once seen as the powerful guiding force behind the legendary group Public Enemy. A symbol of danger. The voice of power that made political hip-hop impossible to ignore. But then the spotlight collapsed. Chuck D was pulled into a life so chaotic it made Hollywood tremble. A statement touching on Jewish people dragged him into a spiral of legal pressure and isolation. A $1 million copyright lawsuit turned the industry against him. Turned on and betrayed by colleagues. At age 65, Chuck D's life is no longer a story of glamour, but a painful, lonely, and brutal journey. The full truth about Chuck D will be revealed. The final tragedy will shock you the most. A child born to break the mold. Chuck D, whose real name is Carlton Douglas Ridenour, was born on August 1, 1960, in Roosevelt, Long Island, New York. From birth, he grew up in a family that allowed no indulgence. It was a household that placed politics education and personal discipline above all personal emotion. His mother loved Motown music and songs from musicals, while his father was a member of the Columbia Record Club and loved jazz. Chuck D never dreamed of becoming a rapper or an artist. What drew him in as a child was sports. He was a die-hard fan of baseball, basketball, and American football with the New York Jets. Around the time he was about 8 years old, those teams won championships one after another. And that sense of victory pulled a young boy deep into the world of sports, where collective emotion explodes and every game is retold like a historical story. Chuck D once said he only wanted to become a sports commentator sitting behind a microphone, listening, analyzing, and translating what happened on the field into language others could understand. He was obsessed with sports talk shows, where voice rhythm and word choice could turn a single play into a shared memory. But in 1977, when Chuck D was about 16 or 17 years old, New York City plunged into a historic blackout. Chuck D began writing lyrics to pass the time, and that historic event ignited his imagination, marking the first moment he stepped onto a musical path. Even so, that moment was not enough to become a direction. Chuck D's life did not move straight toward music. When he entered college, he was dismissed in his first year, forced to take another job before returning to school, and drifting through different classes in a prolonged state of confusion. Chuck D later admitted that when he returned to college as a graphic design student, he believed he was very talented, even overly confident, but had no idea where to apply that ability. He turned down an architecture scholarship at New York Tech, choosing graphic design, because he believed it allowed him greater control over imagery and message, rather than operating within rigid preset frameworks. And it was at college, at a time when he still did not see music as a career, that Chuck D met Flav, along with collaborators such as Bill Stepney and Hank Shockley, the people who would later form Public Enemy with him. From Long Island to the center of cultural power, Chuck D officially laid the foundation for Public Enemy in 1985, together with Flavor Flav. The turning point came when Rick Rubin, co-founder of Def Jam Records, happened to hear the demo Public Enemy No. 1 and immediately decided to sign them. This marked the beginning of one of the most important hip-hop groups in history. Their debut album, Yo Bum Rush the Show, released in 1987, quickly injected a new ideological current into hip-hop political songs, with clear social consciousness, direct and unflinching. Subsequent albums, such as It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back and Fear of a Black Planet, were widely recognized, with tracks like Fight the Power and Burn Hollywood Burn, gradually becoming cultural symbols far beyond ordinary entertainment. This was no longer music for casual listening, but music that forced listeners to confront uncomfortable questions. These albums achieved platinum or gold certification, and Public Enemy performed more than 1,400 concerts in 52 countries. By the late 1990s, the New York Times ranked Public Enemy's albums among the 25 most important albums of the 20th century. Success came too fast. The early albums pushed Public Enemy straight into the center of hip-hop and American social life. But alongside the spotlight came intense scrutiny, endless controversy, and political pressure shadowing every move. Every statement by Chuck D was no longer seen as the words of an artist, but examined like a declaration from an unofficial political figure. The media watched closely. Organizations reacted instantly. The public was pulled into confrontation. Public Enemy became at the same time a symbol, a target, and a threat in the eyes of many. And history soon proved a cold truth. It took only one scandal in 1989 for not just an individual, but an entire movement to be placed on the operating table under the glare of public opinion. Career scandal. The verbal shock that nearly buried an icon. In 1989, when Public Enemy stood at the peak of cultural power, a shock exploded that nearly paralyzed the entire machine Chuck D had painstakingly built. In May of that year, Professor Griff, who held the role of Minister of Information for the group, appeared in an interview with the Washington Times and made shocking anti-Jewish statements. Griff claimed that Jewish people controlled America, accused them of a history of killing black people, blamed them for much of the evil in the world, and suggested a global conspiracy by saying they dominated the gold jewelry industry. These statements did not stand alone. Griff cited classic anti-Semitic texts such as The International Jew by Henry Ford and The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews by the Nation of Islam. The initial reaction did not explode immediately. The statements appeared in the Washington Times, then still a small newspaper with limited reach. Chuck D did not issue an immediate public response. But everything changed when the quotes were broadcast on MTV, turning the story from a press controversy into a national scandal. Mainstream media stepped in. Social organizations condemned it. Protests erupted. Death threats aimed directly at Professor Griff appeared. And from that moment on, the pressure no longer stopped at Griff. It shifted straight onto Chuck D. Many people asked why Chuck D was pulled into the center of the storm when he was not the one who made the statements. The answer lay in the power structure of Public Enemy. Chuck D was not just a rapper in the group. He was the founder, the primary lyricist, the official spokesperson, and according to a later cited legal statement, the sole owner of the Public Enemy trademark. He was the one who originally drew the logo in the mid-1980s, the creative vision and the lead composer of the group. In such a structure, every action by a member reflected directly on the leader. Ultimate responsibility, whether desired or not, rested with Chuck D. Professor Griff's role made that responsibility impossible to escape. Griff was not an ordinary member. He held the title of Minister of Information, a position appointed by Chuck D. himself, tasked with accurately transmitting the values of Public Enemy to the public. When the person responsible for ideological communication misspoke, the entire message of the group was immediately questioned. Notably, according to many reports, Chuck D was not hearing Griff's anti-Jewish statements for the first time. Griff had previously been warned for similar remarks, yet was still allowed to remain in a public role. This led the public to question not just judgment, but the level of responsibility Chuck D was willing to bear. The contradiction became even clearer in the early stage of the crisis. Instead of immediately condemning Griff, Chuck D initially publicly defended him. In a July 1989 interview, when asked whether he supported Griff's statements, he replied briefly, "I back Griff." That stance was quickly seen as Public Enemy's policy. Subsequent remarks, including Chuck D saying that Jewish people are just white people, no different, further intensified accusations that his response lacked a clear moral foundation. Only when the scandal spread, and contracts tours, and the entire image of Public Enemy faced collapse did Chuck D issue an official apology on behalf of the group and remove Professor Griff. This was no longer a purely moral decision, but a matter of survival. However, the cost was already enormous. Even though Griff was later reinstated in a new, largely symbolic role as Supreme Allied Chief of Community Relations, Public Enemy's image never returned to its original state. Controversy spilled into Welcome to the Terror Dome in 1990, when some critics argued that lines such as so-called Chosen Frozen carried anti-Jewish implications. Although Chuck D denied this suspicion had taken root, the consequences of the 1989 scandal were deep and long-lasting. Public Enemy, once seen as the biggest rap group in the world, gradually came to be viewed as marginalized within the very industry they once dominated. And from here, a cold question continues to hang in the air. If Chuck D's image after 1989 was cleaned up to save the legacy, how many details were left behind, not because they did not exist, but because they were too dangerous to speak about publicly? After that shock, Chuck D was no longer just an artist behind a microphone. He became a brand guardian, a message controller, and a man walking through a minefield where a single wrong sentence could place an entire movement on the operating table. Prolonged legal disputes. With flavor, flav. When brotherhood turns into court filings. Public Enemy was born to confront power, but by the late 2010s, the power of money and representation tore them apart from the inside. From 2017 to 2024, the relationship between Chuck D and Flavor Flav was no longer defined by stages, microphones, or shared history, but by lawsuits, legal letters, and cold legal statements. The trigger did not come from a single media shock, but from a prolonged chain of disputes involving copyrights, revenue, and the right to use the Public Enemy image. For the public, the biggest shock was not in the legal details, but in the image. Two founders who once stood side by side, who once shouted the same message together, now spoke to each other through lawyers. Public statements no longer carried the voice of rebellious hip-hop, but the standardized language of court documents. Fans witnessed it like watching a movement bite into its own history. Public Enemy, a symbol of collective spirit, was now split by clauses and signature rights. At the heart of the dispute was who had the right to represent Public Enemy. Chuck D, as founder, primary lyricist, and trademark owner, was seen as holding absolute control. In the disputes, he no longer appeared as an equal member, but as the keeper of the final key to the name Public Enemy. Flavor Flav, once an equally iconic face, publicly expressed dissatisfaction over revenue image usage and how the group was being run. Once the relationship was pushed into legal space, every shared memory was reinterpreted through the lens of interests. Another perspective suggests this was not just a personal conflict. It was a battle over who defines what Public Enemy is and who it belongs to. A collective of equals or a brand managed under a corporate structure. Chuck D represented a vision of message control discipline and protecting the legacy from erosion. Flavor Flav represented symbolic spirit-living memory and the feeling that Public Enemy could not be locked inside paperwork. These two interpretations collided without compromise, and the courtroom became the final battlefield. In that context, the public began to scrutinize money more closely. Reports about Chuck D's assets appeared with conflicting figures, some citing a much higher amount, others offering a far lower number. That inconsistency, while not conclusive evidence, was enough to ignite suspicion. Was money the deeper reason this relationship could not return to what it once was? Or was the issue not the numbers, but control over the narrative and history? The longer it dragged on, the more the dispute eroded the image of both sides. Chuck D was seen by part of the fan base as a cold manager placing ownership above brotherhood. Flavor Flav was seen as emotional, bringing internal conflict into public view. But the most important point was that regardless of who was right or wrong, Public Enemy no longer appeared as a unified force. That very division weakened what once made them most frightening, their collective voice. As legal procedures had yet to fully close, and the aftermath had not faded, Public Enemy remained caught between two states' cultural symbol and legal entity. And then, before the public could catch its breath, a decision by Chuck D in 2024 reignited controversy, pushing the story into a new chapter, where the boundary between ideals and power continued to be tested. Global Music Ambassador, 2024. In 2024, an image made many who grew up with Public Enemy stop and look again. Chuck D, the man who wrote Fight the Power as a direct challenge to the American power structure, appeared as a global music ambassador for the United States Department of State. Not on a stage, not in a confrontational rap, but within an official frame with logos, protocol, and the language of a state institution. For many, that single moment alone was enough to create a sense of dissonance. The decision immediately split the fan community into two clear camps. One side saw it as betrayal. They saw an icon of resistance stepping into a role representing the very government he had criticized for decades. To them, a man who once shouted, "Fight the power," standing inside a global power structure, was not evolution, but surrender. On the other side, those defending Chuck D viewed it as a long-term strategy. They argued that if one wants real impact, standing outside and shouting is not enough. To change things, one must step inside the system and use that space to expand one's voice. Chuck D responded consistently and deliberately. He stated that he did not receive additional pay for the role. No hidden compensation. No commercial contracts attached. According to him, this was a symbolic position meant to use music as a tool for dialogue similar to cultural diplomacy programs from the Cold War era, when jazz was used as a soft language to reduce global tensions. Logically, this argument was not wrong. But the controversy was never really about money. What many could not accept lay in the image. A symbol of resistance standing within an official frame can no longer be read the same way. Even if Chuck D did not change his words or rewrite his past, the new context automatically assigned him a different role. In the public eye, that appearance created a feeling difficult to name. Not exactly selling out, but no longer pure. A subtle shift where ideals may remain intact, but the position of speaking has changed. This was especially sensitive for Chuck D because his entire career was built on the line of confrontation. Public Enemy resisted not only through lyrics, but through their position outside the system. Their power came from belonging to no official power structure. When Chuck D stepped into an ambassadorial role, even unpaid, even with peaceful intentions, he still had to accept a reality that symbols cannot be reversed. Once inside that frame, returning to the old position becomes impossible. That is why this controversy was not simply about right or wrong. It was about a sense of symbolic betrayal. For many who once saw Chuck D as the voice of doubt and defiance, his representation of the United States Department of State created a powerful psychological clash. Not because they believed he changed his ideals, but because they were no longer certain where those ideals were being spoken from. From another angle, it must also be acknowledged that Chuck D was never naive about power. He understands systems media and how images function. Accepting this role may have been a carefully calculated decision, one in which he traded the comfort of his old image to open a new space of influence. But that very clarity made the question sharper, not softer. If Chuck D did not change his ideals, then what did he change to be able to stand in that position without feeling contradiction? Did he change context, strategy, or his understanding of power? And more importantly, does the public have the right to feel a sense of loss when a symbol of resistance steps into a representative role, even with good intentions? This controversy did not end with a definitive answer. It only opened another chapter in Chuck D's journey, where power is no longer viewed in black and white terms. And while the political debate had yet to settle, another layer of pressure was already waiting ahead. Because power does not exist only in official positions, but also in old contracts and agreements that were never fully closed quietly, shaping his legacy in ways few can see. The Universal Records lawsuit. In 2011, when the name Chuck D no longer appeared constantly in headlines as it had during his peak years, another battle began quietly. No microphone, no stage, no crowds chanting slogans. This time, Chuck D stepped into a completely different space: law firm conference rooms, legal files, contract clauses. And his opponent was not an abstract system or invisible power, but Universal Records, one of the largest music conglomerates in the world. The trigger for the lawsuit was not a shocking statement or an impulsive act. It came from questions that were very old, yet had never received satisfactory answers. Who truly owns the recordings? Who has the right to exploit them? Who benefits financially when the work continues to live in new formats? And more importantly, where the artist stands within that chain of power. For Chuck D, this was not a battle to gain more money. It was a battle to define the boundary between creation and ownership. Public Enemy had long been a group that openly criticized corporations, exposing how economic power manipulates popular culture. Chuck D was the one who raised his voice, who asked the questions, who forced the public to look directly at the relationship between money and control. But more than 20 years later, he found himself facing a bitter reality. The works carrying his ideological imprint were sitting inside legal structures he had once condemned. And to keep them, he was forced to use the very language of that system. The lawsuit against Universal Records centered on the use of works exploitation rights and financial benefits, arising in a rapidly changing industry. The digital era opened new revenue streams, but also exposed outdated contracts signed at a time when artists did not fully understand the long-term value of ownership rights. Chuck D entered this fight no longer as a man standing before crowds calling for resistance. He entered as an individual standing alone before a massive legal machine. At this stage, Chuck D's image shifted quietly. He was no longer the man shouting slogans on stage, but the man sitting for hours, with lawyers reviewing every clause, every line of fine print in a contract. His role moved from symbol to guardian of intellectual property. This was a transition without glamour, without media attention, but it was a matter of survival. Because once control over one's work is lost, every message once delivered can be reused in ways the creator no longer has a voice in. Many looked at this lawsuit and called it a paradox. How could a man who once condemned corporations now sue a corporation? But looking deeper, this was not a contradiction. It was the cost of moving too early in an industry that had not yet learned how to protect artists. Chuck D and his generation signed contracts in a time when hip-hop was not yet seen as a long-term asset, when artists often traded ownership for exposure. What followed was not a betrayal of ideals, but the consequence of an uneven structure from the very beginning. What is notable is that battles like this rarely make headlines. There is no dramatic climax, no iconic image, only years of exhaustion where each legal session slowly drains energy. And it is precisely these silent battles that erode an image more than any scandal, because they do not create instant outrage, but plant a lingering doubt inside the artist. Doubt about whether what they created truly belongs to them. Doubt about the value of confrontation, when outcomes are never clear. For Chuck D, the Universal Records lawsuit was not just a legal case. It was a late lesson about the industry's soft power. He had understood the system at an ideological level, but only by stepping into the courtroom did he reach its deepest layer, a place where decisions are made not by morality, but by signatures and timing. And there, those who came first are often the ones who lose the most. The battle lasted many years quiet without a triumphant ending, but it left a clear mark on how Chuck D appeared afterward. He became more cautious, less outspoken, less confrontational. Not because he changed his beliefs, but because he understood that every battle carries a cost that is not always immediately visible. When energy is drained by legal struggles and prolonged disputes, choosing a safer path is sometimes not compromise, but survival. And from here, an unavoidable question began to form. If legal battles stretch on for so many years, does Chuck D still have enough energy to continue confronting even larger power structures? Or at some point, must even the one who once led the movement choose paths with fewer collisions to preserve what remains? After all those confrontations, from stage to courtroom, from slogans to contracts, the biggest question still hangs in the air. When an icon has to fight just to hold on to his own work, what defines his legacy? What he said, or what he was forced to stay silent about in order to protect it? The legacy of Chuck D. When the history of hip-hop is mentioned, Public Enemy is an irreplaceable name, not because of record sales alone, nor just because of global tours or platinum and gold certifications, but because Public Enemy changed how hip-hop spoke to the world. Before them, rap largely revolved around personal stories, the streets, skill, and reputation. After them, rap became a linguistic weapon, a tool for direct confrontation with power media and social structures. At the center of that shift was Chuck D, a man who did not just hold the microphone, but designed the entire ideological architecture of the group. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Chuck D was seen as the moral voice of hip-hop, someone willing to say what others avoided, a true symbol of resistance. But legacy does not stand still. As time passed, the image of Chuck D today became far more complex than the original mold the public once believed in. He is no longer mentioned only as the man who shouted "Fight the power" on stage, but as a figure who tightly controls how the story of Public Enemy and of himself is told. On one level, Chuck D remains an undeniable source of inspiration. He paved the way for countless artists to see hip-hop as a political forum, from conscious rap to protest rap. What Public Enemy achieved created space for Black artists to speak about oppression, racism, and distorted history without asking permission. From that perspective, Chuck D's legacy is foundational. Without him, many voices that came later might not exist or might never have been heard. But on another level, the Chuck D of today is no longer the system breaker he once was. He has become a guardian of legacy at all costs. A man who understands that collective memory is power, and that whoever controls that memory controls how history is understood. In recent years, Chuck D has been deeply involved in reshaping the image of Public Enemy through books, documentaries, exhibitions, and mainstream media projects. He appears as the narrator, the explainer, the one who frames the past. It is here that the dark secret of Chuck D's legacy begins to surface. He no longer lets history speak for itself. He manages history. Old scandals are placed into context. Dangerous edges are softened. Internal conflicts are retold in ways that cause the least damage to the overall image. Chuck D does not erase the past, but he chooses to control how the past is remembered. This is not accidental. After major shocks, especially the scandal of 1989, Chuck D understood clearly that an image can be destroyed by a single detail taken out of context or dug up without control. From that point on, his role gradually shifted. From someone who confronted the system head-on, he became someone who knew how to operate within the system to protect what remained of the legacy. This transition did not happen overnight, but it left clear traces in how Chuck D presents himself to the public today. The final question, therefore, is not simple at all. If Fight the Power today is no longer about shouting on stage, but about holding the right to tell one's own story, has Chuck D betrayed his ideals, or is he simply surviving in a changed world? And perhaps that very ambiguity is his true legacy, a legacy that does not allow easy answers.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.